I should have said this at the outset. The information in here, and we actually talked about this when we were putting the brief together, and I said, you know, I gave my first training on these hallmarks to, in Florida they're called guardians, gals, but they're like CASAs. They're lay folks who, some in our jurisdiction in Miami, some are volunteer, some are actually paid staff, but they're all lay folks who are supported by a guardian ad litem program, and there's attorneys at the program, but the attorneys don't directly represent the children. It's the guardians ad litem, in that case the CASAs, who are going out. So my first presentation of much of this material, much less fleshed out, was to CASAs. And it was from the perspective of what can a lay advocate do? And obviously when the ABA and I started working on this, we wanted to frame it as a guide for attorneys, but I would say 99% of what's in here applies to CASAs as well. Just as a little personal aside, when I was in law school, I volunteered as a CASA. Because I wanted to, this is what I wanted to do with my professional life. And so I got the closest I could to the front by being a CASA. And I happened to work with, as it turns out, one of the premier attorneys in the field, Ann Hare Lambie, who's written books and just brilliant lawyer, child lawyer, happened to be the attorney for the child for whom I was the CASA. And we worked together very, very well on that case. I had a relationship with the child that she was having a difficult time forming. She would get information about certain things going on, or had understanding of the legal process that I did not have, especially at that point. And so we worked very close together to wrap around this child and give her everything she needed in terms of advocacy. And so I actually have had that firsthand experience of knowing what it's like to work. And we, in that case, we played to each of our strengths. And I think there's things that CASAs can do. I don't know what your rules are here, but I know in Arizona, for example, there were certain things that a CASA could do that an attorney just wasn't supposed to be doing, you know, in terms of, or what, I shouldn't say wasn't supposed to be doing, wouldn't have the time and resources to do, let's put it that way. And so we work together. So if you see things as I'm going through, feel free to jump in as well, but I'll try to remember that. Okay, so self-assessment is done. We'll just put that aside for now. And so let's talk about what does it mean to be child-centered. We hear this family-centered and child-centered. This is something that's become a fairly common term of art in recent years. But really what I mean by it is that everything you do and say as an advocate is centered on the needs and the interests and the development of that child. It's not about what's easy and convenient for the adults in the case, whether it's the attorney, whether it's the parents, whether it's the grandparents, but it's all about how do we best meet that child's needs. Now that doesn't mean being child-centered means excluding the interests and needs of others involved with the case, because this child exists within a context, and that context is his or her family. So clearly I'm not saying those needs are not important, but as that child advocate, you know, I've heard in court different things being said. For example, oh, that kid's, God, there's that drug mom again, or there's that. And I mean, I've said these things. I'm not going to lie. I mean, when I was practicing in court, you know, oh gosh, that case again with that mom who does X, Y, and Z. And if you take a step back and you start thinking, well, what would this sound like to the child? Even if it's a baby and she could understand, what would this sound like? What would that feel like? Well, it kind of just changes your perspective, and it puts you behind the eyes of that child. And since you have this aptly named project called Through the Eyes of the Child, it's really about seeing the world through the baby's eyes, understanding what their experience is like, not coming at this with the assumption that they aren't having feelings, emotions, responses, experiences, that they are not an emotional and sensible person as well, sensitive person as well. I think, and maybe you guys don't feel this way, but my experience has been, well, you know, I've heard these things like, well, she's just 1 year old. What does she know? She doesn't know what's going on. Well, maybe she doesn't understand what's going on, but certainly she knows something is going on if she's not seeing mom every day. She may not be able to articulate it. She might be articulating it through her behavior, but certainly there's something affecting that child. And I think being child-centered is really standing behind that child's eyes and understanding what this process is like for them, what it's like to be going through this process, and really putting the baby's needs at the driving wheel, at the steering wheel. Having the baby's needs be driving your advocacy and driving what you're doing on behalf of that child, and not getting completely bogged down in the legal process. I know that's a strange thing to say to lawyers, but I think that happens a lot, and I've seen it happen a lot around the country in different areas that I've worked with, where everyone's so bogged down in fighting about X, Y, or Z. And I don't think that's probably the case here, since you have such a collaborative process already. But what's important to the baby and what's important to that young child kind of gets left over here while the adults are fighting. Does this kind of make sense? A little bit. Okay, good. So here are some just very concrete things that you can do as CASAs and as lawyers to understand, to be child-centered in your practice. There's very concrete ways to do this. First, you need to learn the child's history, and I actually think it's more learning the child's story, understanding what that child's experience was like from the day that child entered the world. There are very easy ways to do this. Probably a lot of this you do in your practice already. Getting information about what kind of prenatal care the baby had, medical and dental care history, relationships with key caregivers, who was taking care of this child before he or she entered our world? This child had many experiences, probably multiple caregivers. Who are those people that helped bring her this far in the world? What's her story? What's her history? What are the things that are familiar to her? And I don't know how many of you have kids, and I'll try not to talk about my kids too much, but you know, I have a daughter who is now 6. I have several, but this one in particular is 6. And she's had this one blanket, and still to this day, and she's just finishing kindergarten, she takes that blanket to school with her every day. She leaves it in my car, that's our deal. But, you know, I don't know that I would be able to get her out the door. And here she's at home, she's with her mother, she's in a comfort zone. But still, it's those little things that make a huge difference. For anyone that knows kids or has kids and has experienced what it's like. So I think these familiar comforting items are actually of primary importance. Now, in terms of how can attorneys and CASAs work together to make this happen, I think this is a really good example. There's going to be some information perhaps that a CASA has by virtue of the work that you're doing with the child that the attorney may or may not have. Hopefully after today, some of the attorneys might ask a few more questions that they're not used to asking, but in terms of, you know, maybe the CASA is the one that knows that, you know, the little 2-year-old needs to bring Teddy everywhere she goes to feel comfortable. So whether it's going for family time, whether it's going to preschool, whatever it is, little Teddy has to come. That might be something that just the CASA knows. And that would be good for you all to share with each other because it might impact. Say the issue of placement change comes up. Well, one of the things you're going to want to focus on, I know it sounds little, is whether or not that item, that Teddy, is going to come with and be part of the transition. Do not forget Teddy, because that will help. Another thing that I don't know if you all do in your regular practice, but I think is very, very important for attorneys and CASAs, and this is, again, maybe something when you have both on a case, which doesn't happen in every case, right, that you have a CASA. Yes, it's on every case, there's a CASA and an attorney? No, I have this, I have this. Oh, okay. Sorry. So, you know, one of you might divide up some of this work between the two of you that would be naturally divisible and then come together and share the information. But it's very, very important, I think, to put together a timeline of the things that have happened to this child, both positive and negative, so that you have a good picture, a good understanding of that child's life. If you are representing an older child, for example, a 12-year-old, you could sit down with them and they can tell you, well, these are the things that, at least that were important to them, that impacted their life. You know, when I was 6, we moved to a different county. I had to go to a new school. You know, when I was 8, This is what I saw dad do to mom, those kinds of things. But when you're talking about pre-verbal or newly verbal children, they're not going to be able to give you that information, but it's important for you to know. You need to know it moving forward. Now, excuse me one second. Now, I think getting to know your client, building that client-attorney relationship, or CASA, I guess they're not your clients, but the CASA-child relationship. I think we all know that, we would all agree, maybe, that for an older child, that makes a lot of sense. It comes to us, maybe not naturally, but it's something that you see as part of your role. But, and I'm not going to ask you to answer this out loud, but I wonder how many folks actually realize that it's extremely important to get to know all of your clients, including the ones that are still babes in arms, including the ones that are just learning to walk, including the ones that are just potty training. It's really important for you to get to know them, but I think maybe we could all galvanize around that concept. Okay, fine. Okay, so how do I do that? How do I do that if I'm a lawyer? I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a social worker, I'm not a teacher. How do I do that in a way that's actually going to give me information that I need to be more child-centered in my advocacy and to really understand what this child is telling me? And I remember when I first started putting this concept of get to know your child client out there, people kind of look at me like, you're crazy. It's a baby. But there really are some concrete things that you can do to get to know. And a lot of it involves the power of observation. And some of it might even involve you getting a little bit out of your comfort zone and interacting, maybe sitting on the floor and interacting with these very young kids. So what's important first is that you start with the concept, yes, you can develop a relationship with a very young child. For those of you that are parents or know children that are very young, you've probably developed a relationship with them, with your nieces, your nephews, your children, of course. You've developed a relationship. How did you do that? Well, you probably did it by sitting on the floor with them and playing, reading a book to them, watching them tell you, for the little preschool age kids of 4 and 5-year-olds, having them tell you, possibly in nonsensical terms, about their favorite character in a book or their favorite character on TV. And by listening and watching, that is how the relationship develops. Well, it's not really that much different for an attorney or for a CASA with a very young child. And they can tell you how they're doing by what they are doing. So they can tell you how they're doing by what they're doing. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to become an expert in infant mental health or early childhood development. If there are observations that are, and there's some very concrete things that you can look for, but there's some things that just don't seem right from a developmental standpoint or from an interaction standpoint, that's when you go and you consult a professional. You talk to someone who, you say, this is what I saw. Because we're not qualified to interpret these behaviors. We're qualified to look at them and see them. But we then need to be talking to people who are more well-versed than probably most of us in early childhood development and say, okay, when I went into the house, and we're going to have this in our scenario, a similar situation, but when I went into the house, this is what I saw. The baby is 1.5 years old, no sounds coming out of that baby's mouth, nothing. And I tried to play with him. I got on the floor. I tried to, no interaction. Really just kind of dull, just no affect. That, maybe you don't know what that means, but you certainly would want to go find out more about that. That baby is telling you something, and you have to find out what that is. Now here's the one I almost don't put up because I know how hard this is. There's just like the family time guidelines and how often very young children should be visiting with or spending time with their families of origin. To develop a relationship, to really get to know a very young child, you do need to see them regularly. I mean, I'm not going to say weekly, but I mean even weekly. I know that that's a challenge, but monthly would be ideal. And I think your guidelines say you have to visit with for the attorneys at least. I'm not so sure about the CASA guidelines. Every 6 months, yeah, 2 weeks after appointment. within 2 weeks of appointment, and then every 6 months. Do I have that right?
And there's also a recommendation, in the guidelines, that every time there's a placement.
But right. So I wonder how difficult it would be, or how challenging, or whether you could do some problem solving or strategic thinking around how you could get for those kids on your caseload that are under 5 out to see them a little more regular. You're going to find out much more information about how they are doing and what is going on with them if you can do that. And I certainly don't want to be someone who comes in from the wild world of Miami and tells you should be doing this. But I will go as far to say as it would be extremely beneficial to you in terms of your advocacy, and to them in terms of having someone who's checking up on what's going on in the home, and who's another person that's got eyes on that child, and eyes not just a safety, not just looking at safety, but looking at development, looking at whether or not that child's needs are being met in that environment. So I realize it's somewhat controversial to come and say you should see these kids every month, but I think it needs to be said, just like visitation and family time between very young children and their families needs to happen frequently, which I know is a burden for caseworkers. It's the same concern. But if we're going to do this right, we have to go with what we know in terms of what works. Now, for those of you who may not be very comfortable interacting with very young children, which could be many of us, in the brief on page 11, I even wrote the page number up there, page 11 to 13, we've listed some developmentally appropriate activities that you can do when you go on a home visit. And by and far, people seem the most responsive to these 2 pages in the book because it's very concrete information, and I'm trying to put my money where my mouth is, and I consulted with, there's a whole advisory committee that oversaw this brief and made sure everything in it was 100% accurate. And I had wonderful input from occupational therapists, infant mental health professionals, clinicians, giving additional input and making sure everything in that list is right on target in terms of child development and in terms of what kind of activities. Now, the thing you need to remember is, going back to some of the statistics we talked about earlier, a lot of these children will have, I think we said 50%, will have some sort of developmental delay. So when you're thinking about what's age appropriate, it has to be kind of development, where are they from a developmental age perspective? Because some 12 and 18 months old can't do some of the things, so you go up to a younger set in terms of the activities. Have any of you done any of these things with any of your child client? Yeah, great. I personally think it's fun to sit down and play with a baby, especially when you don't have to then take care of them for the rest of the day. But for some, I do recognize that it can be a little out of your comfort zone and might feel strange. And why am I doing this? I went to law school and I didn't go into preschool teaching. So I understand that. But I do think hopefully some of these will help you break the ice, if it will, with your clients. Another really important thing for you when you're doing your home visits is to have a very keen eye on how the child interacts with the substitute caregiver. So whether it's foster mom, grandma, does the baby smile and gurgle? A little baby, is there eye contact, or is there like a lot of looking away? Does the toddler use her caregiver as a point of reference? You know what that means. So they kind of come out and talk to you a little bit, and then they kind of like go and like hang on to grandma's leg for a while and kind of size you up, and then maybe they'll come and show you another toy, and then, well, maybe I'm not so sure about who you are. And is that caregiver someone that's a source of security? That's how you're going to know. Does the preschooler talk with her caregiver and show off new skills? Do you see them interacting that way? Do you see her, when you go on a home visit, one of the things I think we say to do with the preschoolers is, they love to draw at that age, many of them. So have them draw a picture. Does she then go over and show grandma, here's a picture? You want to gauge how secure that young child is feeling in that relationship. And we've locked you in. Sorry. She's trying to escape, but she can't. So it doesn't mean you have to understand what everything means, right? But again, it's about using your powers of observation and about keying in on those most important things. It's also very important to get to know the child's caregiver. I'm sure this is not news to you. The one thing I think is one of the things that's really hard, though, is to not let that caregiver's perspective on things become your perspective on things. To really try to maintain a boundary and stay independent. And it's very difficult to do with very young children because, you don't have a kid telling you this, and this is going on. You don't have a child saying, well, I remember having a case with an older child who the foster mother had a lock on the refrigerator. And they were telling her, the fridge has a lock on it, and I can't get food unless it's those particular times that foster mom says we can eat, and which was extremely upsetting. That's not a most home-like environment. That's the most prison-like environment. And so, but a very young child kind of can't tell you that, and so. I'm sure you've all had that experience where you have a foster parent saying, yeah, everything's fine, everything's great, everything's going on, and then you talk to the kid and the kid's like, the fridge is locked and she's not home when she's supposed to be home, those kinds of things. I'm pretty sure that doesn't just happen in Miami. But so it's important to get to know your client's caregivers, but it's also really important to keep some sort of boundary and distance and to be able to take their information and weigh it against other observations that you've had. And they may be somewhat contradictory. Hopefully not. Hopefully that's not the case. But there may be information that the caregiver is providing even about their own, if a caregiver is a grandma or a family, a relative, for example, certain things they might be telling you about mom and dad and visitation may not be exactly accurate because they're trying to protect their kin. And so it's just so much more difficult with very young children because you have to be much more able to filter and assess the information you're getting. So here are some of the things that researchers have said are really important to see in a caregiver of a very young child. Am I blocking your view? Okay. Demonstrating empathy, flexibility, and adaptability. Again, if you've ever been around a very young child, you know that those are kind of essential aspects of caring for a very young child. Things change quickly with them. They can handle dysregulated infants. Dysregulated infant is an infant who screams a lot. So think colicky baby. Not all people are cut out, especially if it's not their own child, and even if it is their own child, they're not all cut out to deal with a kid who's screaming or crying all the time. A baby, especially that infant cry can, I still have some memory of that. It definitely takes a special kind of person to be able to handle that, and we don't always think about that when we're assessing caregivers. Has positive responses when baby expresses needs, doesn't shoo the baby away, the toddler away and pulling on, I need this, or I'm hungry, or I'm thirsty, no, I'm talking to the adults kind of thing, who's able to say, to stop and say, this is a very young child, she has a need, that kind of thing. Willing to play with and follow the baby's nonverbal cues. Now, this is a very hard thing, I think, for a lot of people, certainly for a lot of parents, let alone substitute caregivers, to say, okay, not to be overly controlling and overly kind of aggressive in terms of making the baby do what you want to do in terms of play. Now, obviously, when it's time to get up and go in the car, there are certain things you just have to do. But for caregivers, especially with kids who have delays, it's really important that they can kind of understand and let the baby's needs drive the interaction. And this is just so important because if the goal is reunification and you're really working towards reunification, you need a caregiver who's not going to sabotage. And just going back to the fact that with very young children, it's even, I think, more challenging to figure out what's going on, because you don't have a kid telling you, well, I like visiting with mom, I'm having fun on the visits, you know, she's taking me to Burger King, it's all fine. And you have a caregiver telling you, mom's kids are coming back a mess, mom's doing X, Y, or Z. You have to really have conversations with the caregiver and possibly even watch her interactions with biological parents to really understand if she's supporting reunification. Has anyone had that experience where? Well,
and I tend to be a parent's attorney, but I had it come up recently, but there have been occasions, a lot of foster parents tend to adopt around here.
Right.
And
A limited pool.
yeah, sometimes you get this sense, especially from the parent's perspective and as parent's attorney, that, okay, they want to adopt this child, they don't want reunification.
Right, right. So, and we'll talk about concurrent case planning and the challenges of that.
Part of it, in the case I've been involved in, is the mixed messages from HHS that there's a dual goal here of reunification and adoption.
Right, concurrent case plan.
And at times I can't tell where the caseworker is going with it, and I can't necessarily tell where the placement folks. I'd say the ones I've had have been pretty objective with placement folks.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that you get a mixed message automatically.
Right. I mean, sorry, go ahead. I mean, I think, and we'll talk a little more about concurrent case planning, but one of the essential elements of concurrent case planning is that you have a substitute caregiver who understands and can live with that dual role. And I think it's a very unique person, who can really do that. I mean, in Miami we call them resource parents, where, you know, they understand they're in this possibly for the short term or possibly for the long term. They can live with that balance, and they do what they can to support reunification. Another thing that I'll just bring it up here. Have you all heard of a concept called coparenting? No, this is something new to me. About a year ago, we have a judge in Miami, Judge Jerry Cohen, who's gotten very interested in the concept of co-parenting, and it's sort of taking the concept of concurrent planning a little bit further, where the foster parent or it's typically a trained person who's trained foster parent really becomes almost a coach to the biological parent, and their families become, again, a really special kind of person who can do this and do it right. Their families become almost like one. And she's kind of fostering the whole mother, father, child dynamic, and she's role modeling, and she's saying, we're going to the doctor, you know, so-and-so, the baby has a doctor's appointment tomorrow, you know, you need to be at my house at such and such time, or meet me there. Really incorporating the parent and showing that parent how to be modeling proper parenting behavior and proper interactions. And so if reunification happens, there's a resource for the parent in that foster parent. And if reunification doesn't happen, permanency happens much more quickly, and there maintains some continuity, unless it's obviously not safe for the child, between the biological parent and the child. Even after adoption, it's sort of a win-win for the child. And so this concept of co-parenting is something that we're really trying to implement in Miami with a core group of foster parents who are interested in. And when you talk to foster parents, I promise I'll get to you, when you talk to foster parents, from what I've learned from the co-parenting literature, they like, a lot of them really like this. A lot of the foster parents interviewed said, in this video we saw, said, I've always wanted to develop more of a relationship with the parent. I've always wanted to know more about the parent. I've been prevented from doing that by whether it's rules, whether it's things they're being told by attorneys, or whatever it is. I've wanted to be more involved because I think I can help this person. I mean, so again, a really special kind of foster parent, but it's taking that concept of what you're talking about and really kind of pushing the envelope with it. Let me get this gentleman in the back.
Where does the family support provider fit into that kind of dynamic? 'Cause that's the kind of stuff, we have family support that does a lot more of that.
Explain to me what you mean by family support provider.
The person who supervises visits and.
So like the caseworker or?
No, the caseworker, this is another person who's contracted it's a private company that the state contracts with, who will supervise visits. They will redirect parents during the visits for their behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
There's a person who sits there during the supervised visit.
Okay, so they,
And then they end up doing a lot of that stuff that you're talking about too.
which is I think wonderful, but I don't know if that's the same as co-parenting. I think it's a little bit different. I don't.
Judge, maybe he might be hitting on this, but we're just introducing this new program, Icebreakers, where the foster parents and the biological parents get together right away at the beginning of the case to do
That's
this,
very similar.
get rid of the sabotage perception. Have you had any experience with programs like that?
And I'm not really intimately involved with what's going on with the co-parenting, but I think it's a similar concept, exactly that. And I mean, I think the whole family group decision-making concept is similar to getting everyone around the table, getting kind of galvanized around a common cause, which is healing the family, getting the family back together, and everyone being on the same page, and understanding that it may not happen and that we need to have a plan B. And so, yeah, I think that that sounds to me a lot like the co-parenting concept. Sir?
The family, the conference required pre-hearing conference is going a long way.
Right.
I think clearing that up and cutting down the traditional adversarial approach. Here's everybody, and you may have cousins, aunts, uncles, as the attorneys, etc. So they connect a personality
Right.
with the roles.
I mean, I've read about your pre-hearing conferences, and I've learned about it in some of the work I do nationally, and I think I'm pretty sure it's being touted as a best practice because of all the things you just highlighted. And certainly for all children, but definitely for very young children, being able to start like that can really lead to much quicker permanency and much less, fewer placement changes, all those things that we know puts very young children at risk. Judge, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it's been covered that I was going to have Michelle talk about, tell us about the icebreaker meeting that we're having there in the near future so that everybody be aware of our icebreaker program. But Mr. Davis pointed that out.
That's great. That's wonderful. Yes,
I
Vicki.
just want to say that Nebraska is like the rest of the country in that there's really been a huge shift in the last decade from viewing the bio parents as threatening and dangerous to the foster parents. I mean, until recently, we have open court records where people
Bless you.
wouldn't put in the foster parent's address.
Right.
And I think they're still not always doing it because there was this idea that the parents would be harassing them and worse. But I think there's a growing recognition that the vast majority of the cases are cases of neglect, not violence
Right.
necessarily. And that I think there's just been a shift. And so there's been more openness for foster parents to not demonize or be afraid of the parents. And obviously there are some of those violent cases as well. And I think those are different. But
Right.
it used to be that all cases would be like that.
Right.
And now I think there's been a real shift.
And it actually kind of goes to the concept of being child-centered, is really viewing each situation as unique, viewing each child's life and each child's family context and each child's substitute caregiving context as unique to that child, and not kind of generalizing and lumping everyone together. Well, I've seen this kind of case before, therefore. And I think that's really hard to do when you have a lot of cases, you are seeing a lot of the same things. It is hard to sort of individualize, but I think it's a mandate that all of us have in our work to, from creating individualized case plans to being able to view each child individually within their own, what's important to them, what matters to them, who are the most influential relationships in their life. That's going to be unique to each individual, just like it is for everyone in this room. So I think that's it's a nice shift to see happening, but it does make it hard, and that's okay. So the home environment is another thing that, it's important whether you're a CASA or whether you're an attorney to be out there and making sure that, especially for very young children, and it's the little things, if you read about home safety, it's the little things that can be very important. Again, outlet covers, things like that, so that we're not further putting kids at risk by whatever home environment they're in. And especially if it's a home that isn't a licensed home, and it's grandma or grandpa or aunt and uncle, they may not be prepared to be taking a little one in. So these are things that are they're small things, but again, can make a really big difference in safety. So you can see all this. One of the most important things, and I'll get to why in a minute, is books. Books. Really, toys are good, but pots and pans are fine toys. Books are really important. There's a lot of research around being read to. You've probably all seen it even in the mainstream media about how important it is for very young children in terms of their language development and their communication development to have exposure to books at even a very young age. It doesn't mean they have to be like doing all the Baby Einstein videos, but having some books around and being comfortable with books. When Judge Lederman found this out, one of the first things she started doing was just every time, whether the baby came to court or not, she would just start handing out books. If there's a child 5 years or younger in the case, she would give it to the caregiver, she'd give it to the to the caseworker. Just make sure I want that baby to have at least one book in their life, So they're again not the biggest thing, but very, very important for their development.
I think crossing over a little bit to what the caseworker does. I mean, I wouldn't go into the house and look to see whether there's food in the pantry. I kind of feel like that's not my job as the guardian ad litem.
Right. No, and I get that, but I think it is. I believe that it is because for this age it is because I don't know that my experience has been that, and this isn't to disparage anyone that works for a state agency, but we've had many instances, at least in our community, where folks said they were visiting who weren't. People said they were seeing kids who weren't. And so I feel for this age group, where they can't say, if you can't ask this child, have you seen your caseworker in the past 30 days or whatever your state standards are. So I think it is actually quite important. It doesn't mean you're snooping around. It doesn't mean that you're looking under beds and looking in cupboards, but you're coming for a home visit. And these are things that maybe you wouldn't naturally look for, but things that I think are important to look for. I do. I think it's another layer of safeguard.
We have team meetings on a monthly basis, so most everyone in here at Dawson County, almost everyone gets together. Also, if you've been doing this because we are very, somewhat rural and we all pretty well know each other, if you've been doing this for more than a couple of years, then you know all the foster parents.
Right.
You see them in Walmart with the kids. You might run into them at church. I wouldn't necessarily feel a need to go make sure that there's food in the pantry because I know these people. I know what kind of foster parents they are and what kind of people they are. So, and I trust our social work.
Okay.
See, my perspective is it's my job to independently assess and verify what's reported in team meetings and to make that home visit and sit down and watch the interaction, if there's siblings, interaction with the care providers. And, I may not go looking in the pantry, but if those kids are sitting in the counter or cowering when, on care provider, it may not be the care provider's fault, but I'm not going to get that in a team meeting. I'm not going to get that in the courtroom. And so independent of everyone else, I'm not a caseworker, but I need to make my own independent assessment of where that child is living and how that child's interacting.
Right, and I guess that's a really nice way of sort of underscoring my point, which is, and it's not to be suspicious of everything, but it's to develop an independent assessment. And I wouldn't say this is where looking in the pantries or it's not your job necessarily to bring the books. I'm not suggesting that, but it's to see if there are things in the child's environment that are supporting his or her development, and it's really using a child developmental framework as as elevating things that maybe before weren't as important to you, but are important to that child's healthy development and important to your developing an independent evaluation of what's going on for that child, seeing it through that child's eyes. Vicki?
I just wanted to say, given all of the transitions that have been going on with the private agencies and the privatization and the backup and all that, and I don't know in Lexington per se, but there certainly has been a lot of transitions and workers leaving, and it's not clear that all of the safety net that was there before is always there. And I do think, at least until things settle down, you know, however long that takes. We were talking, Candice is from Florida, that has been doing privatization for a number of years, and they rolled it out in a much more methodical, planful way, and she thinks it's working okay, so far. But anyway, I do think it would be a mistake for a guardian litem or CASA advocate to assume that everything is fine for young children. That being said, when you do live in a small town, I think there are a lot of shortcuts that people can take, because if you already know the foster parents and know them well, you might need to go quickly to observe the interactions with this particular child, but you know that things are going well, or if you know the caseworker is still the same one that you've known for 50 years and know that her word is gold or his word is gold, then you can depend on that.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to stop here so that we have time to do the interaction. So another thing, for those of you that have very young kids on your caseloads, which I'm assuming is at least all of you, are a lot of them in childcare environments, or they're home most of the day, or early? Do you have early Head Start here, or Head Start? Most of them are in daycare situations. Because this is something, and Vicki and I were talking about this last night, is that at the national level has been getting a lot more attention, and there was a letter that just went out from the Children's Bureau talking about how important it is specifically for kids who are involved with the child welfare system to be in quality childcare. And that's something I know as an advocate I wasn't really clued into at all, quite honestly, and it's something in Miami we've started to put a lot of focus on, and had the opportunity recently to be involved with a research study that actually looked at, they paired kids who were in, let me skip to that slide because it might help kind of, it paired kids who were not in the child welfare system with kids who were in the child welfare system, specifically had a dependency court case, and were in the same classroom in a particular child care center. And it was a very kind of complicated research study because and they looked at these kids over 2 years. They looked at them every 6 months, and they looked at them from they did a whole developmental assessment every 6 months to see where the child started and to see how the child progressed. And they measured it against all these different assessments that you can do of classroom environment, of the child care setting environment, and the teacher interactions and behaviors. And what they found was that, and this sort of was underscored by this great letter that came out from the Children's Bureau about how important it is for children in child welfare to have quality child care. And I realized it's very difficult, even in a big community like Miami. We don't have necessarily that many child care centers that have high quality, that would kind of fall in the high quality list, who are also willing to take the subsidized payment that's offered by the county for these kids who are in child welfare. So we're challenged in a very similar way probably than as most communities. But what they found is that the quality of child care for child welfare kids is a predictor of language, communication, and cognition. So kids who had better quality environments, all else being equal, and all the demographics were level playing field in terms of the demographics and whatnot, those kids who had better classroom environments and better quality in the interaction with the teachers scored better developmentally. It was impacting their brain. Again, those early life experiences changing the way that their brains and bodies develop. The number of books in the home had a significant impact on developmental outcomes for these child welfare kids. The number of placement changes in child welfare was a significant and negative predictor of the total developmental scores, and specifically communication. So looking at So my involvement in the study was I looked at all the different placement changes that these young kids had had, and we have challenges with that. And for the kids who had frequent placement changes, their scores developmentally went down, even when their childcare environment was considered sufficient. So it's so important that when we're looking at the environments that these young kids are in, that we're also looking at their childcare center. And again, that's something that we may not, it doesn't mean you have to go in and do an assessment of the childcare center. It'd be good to go and see it, probably. I would say at least once, and to see how the child's doing there, because again, that child can't tell you, but to get some information from, however you can get it from your community, about the quality of the childcare environment. And so at a minimum, these are some of the things, and this is on, this is sort of nationally accepted quality, looking at quality in childcare, aside from the environment, which is a whole nother component, but the teachers get down to the child's level, no yelling, non-shaming, all the things that we are asking their parents not to do, we're asking their substitute caregivers not to do, we need to be asked, or to do or not to do, we need to be asking that of their childcare environment. These kids spend 8-10 hours a day there sometimes. This has a huge impact on their development. Just assessing quality childcare, if you do nothing else, which I know you will do other things, will make a huge impact for them. And it might just be bringing in some additional resources to that childcare center. Maybe that's something that the community can galvanize around to make sure that they're educated about the special needs of young children in child welfare. As we learned earlier, these are unique kids. They're not the typical kid that you're going to see in the population at large.
I know you're in a hurry to get to the thing, but I have a question.
A little bit.
It seems like that we're learning that the foster parents choose the child care for the child. Is that true here also? And they tend to choose it based on convenience. That's not here. The workers are more involved.
No, the foster parents would be the ones.
The foster parent, and so I do think, because what we've seen in some other places, that they tend to pick the place down the street or something convenient, which is understandable, but for this group of children, that convenience factor, if you're looking at it through the child's needs, is much less important than the high quality and stability of the child care. So we urge the advocates to get involved in that and make recommendations to the court or whatever that help support the child being in top quality. There's no children that more need high quality child care than children in the child welfare system. So.
And one of the things that again sort of was driven by Judge Learman is when she started learning about some of the poor quality, came from child advocates, came from our CASAs, who were saying, I went out and saw the child in this child care center, and let me tell you, it's worse than the home they were removed from. And so the judge started getting very concerned about the kind of quality, and so we started with a list of accredited child care centers, and then we started with a list of, we have all different kinds of rating systems in our community of quality. And so now there's sort of an administrative order, I believe, or no, there's a policy from the Child Welfare Agency that we worked out collaboratively, pardon me, as a community. And now it's sort of, we all understand that children in the dependency system have to be in one of these child care centers. The other thing that I think is really important is when there is a placement change, when a child has to be moved from his or her home environment for whatever reason, it's really important to try, if the child care is of good quality, it is really important to try to maintain that, because if not, you're stripping yet another relationship from that child's life. And again, it's all about the relationships that they have that helps them develop a sense of who they are, helps them develop the feelings of security and safety, and allows them to develop in a manner that we want to see them develop. So that's really important. And I've sped through a few things, but you have a lot of the other information. The last point I want to end, and then we'll move to the activity, is having young children brought to court. And it's not just sort of my idea, it's actually something that's envisioned by the ABA standards on practice standards on representing representing children in child abuse and neglect proceedings. I don't think I got the name right. I always mess that one up. But we all have heard of the ABA standards. And it's about the importance of the judge seeing all children, not necessarily at every hearing, but I think we forget for very young children or we don't think that there's really a value in that. And one of the most important things that I've learned in watching what happens when very young children come to court is the whole focus changes. Everyone behaves better, first of all. At least in Miami, we have behavioral issues in court, some of the professionals. Take that off the videotape, please. But also, I think the focus changes because you kind of can't help but pay attention to the fact that there's a very young child in the room. Either they don't let you, or it's just nice to see a baby being held. And this gives the judge a lot of information about how the child is doing. I mean, you get to lay eyes on the child, and it gives advocates an opportunity. It's sort of it's a piece of evidence, if you will, for the judge to see that how this child is doing, to see what the child's needs are. And it doesn't mean you have to bring them to every hearing. It doesn't mean that it's something they need to stay for the whole hearing. But the standards, as well as I think just sort of best practice, definitely envisions children coming to court irrespective of their age. And so, and keeping everyone mindful of the fact that these are not just paper children. These are not just children who are a file. And I think, and I don't know what it's like in your community, but I know in Miami, the volume is so high. And we have so many cases, thousands of kids in care. And there's really nothing more effective than slowing down the process and getting folks centered when a child, whatever age, but even especially a very young child, is brought to court. So that's just one thing I want to make sure and underscore. Is that something that happens frequently here, that the very young ones come to court? You guys are trendsetters here. It's wonderful.
All children come to court.
All children, every hearing. That's unique.
That's why it happens.
That's unique because the judge, yeah. We have a variation on that. Let's just say, where we have certain times where they come to court, certain times when they're excused from coming to court, and
I would say Lexington is unique in that.
yeah. Is that are you not from Lexington? Okay, so that's not happening in your jurisdiction.
I practice in a couple other counties, and that is not happening in other counties.
Mm-hmm.
Occasionally, the older kids will come to court, but very rarely, if at all, do we have the other kids.
Mm-hmm. And if you as a lawyer said, I think that my client has a right to be in court or needs to come to court, or I'd like the judge to meet my client, would that be something that would be met with a lot of resistance, or be like, what's she talking?
In Nebraska, we have such difficulty in distances.
Yeah.
That as much as anything, a lot of the kids would be traveling 50 miles plus
Yeah.
to get to court
Yeah.
and then back.
Yeah.
And we have a real issue with resources
Right.
to do that. So
Right.
I don't know if any of our judges would resist that. I think sometimes
It's just a logistical. And possibly not developmentally appropriate, right? I mean, we certainly want to be mindful that if it isn't developmentally appropriate or isn't just appropriate in terms of the well-being of the child, driving 50 miles both way may not be the best. But in that instance, I mean, there are some things you can do. You can have pictures, you can have, again, anything to sort of elevate the fact that this process is about this real child. And I think it's really important. It's not because people don't care. It's just because it's easy to get overwhelmed very quickly with this work. So, yes.
A lot of the courts are trying to use Skype.
I was going to suggest Skype, but then I thought.
And I think that the foster parents, you could even get them a $15 camera for their computer, but there could be a couple minutes for the judge to observe the child.
Skype, we've got to start using this technology. At least that's what I'm being told by people. Took me a while to get. Okay, so we're going to cut a tiny bit into break time, but I promise we will have a break. So let's take out our green papers, please. And just go ahead and take a moment to read this, because I don't want to. I think you prefer me not to read it to you, but I can if you like.